Now, this is the second installment of a series that we started last week called Building a Life of Wisdom. And last week we said that wisdom is a suite of aptitudes and attitudes that help us to navigate through the treacherous social and moral waters of life. Wisdom helps us to have a prosperous and productive life, but it also protects us from the harm that usually comes to lazy, simple, and foolish people. More importantly, wisdom is valuable because it connects us with the mind of God, and because it helps us to become a better version of ourselves. So how do we build that life of wisdom? Well, last week we sort of laid the foundation by explaining what wisdom is, but how do we actually build a life that is wise? Well, that's what Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 12 helps us do. What you've got here is you've got 6 little couplets. You'll see verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, verse 5, verse 6, and so on. Okay? And sort of the usual pattern is maybe you give an exhortation, do this, and then you give some kind of explanation. And that's the first verse. And then the second verse will explain, well, this is why you do that. And a lot of times it does that by explaining, this is the benefit of living this particular kind of life. Okay? And so you should always be aware of how the writer of Proverbs follows this structure, or maybe breaks the structure a little bit. Okay? So what that means is we've got these 6 things, these 6 couplets, and I've described them as 6 pillars upon which a life of wisdom is built. Now, you might expect us to start, well, where else? In the beginning, right? To start with verses 1 and 2, work your way through. That's not what we're going to do. And the reason is because it's the pillars that are in the middle that are the most important. And the one we're looking at today may be the most important of all. So, if we're going to live a life of wisdom, we need to begin by trusting the Lord. You're like, well, that was easy. I could have preached that sermon before I walked in here. Great, we get to go home. Not so fast. Because, of course, any of us who've ever actually tried to trust the Lord know that it is fraught with complication. So let's just take this one step at a time. What does it mean to trust the Lord? What does it mean to trust the Lord? Now, if you were with us several weeks ago, we talked about this sort of foundational definition of what it means to trust God. And we said that what it means is to trust God's abilities, character, and intentions. That's what really it means to have faith. It means to trust God's abilities, character, and intentions. But the people who wrote Proverbs are nothing if not practical. So they want to help us understand what that means and how we sort of manifest that trust in our lives, how we sort of make that trust obvious. And they do that by giving us, so you've got this initial exhortation, trust in the Lord with all your heart. But then you have a parallel negative exhortation. And then verse 6 starts with another parallel exhortation, but this time it's positive. Okay? And so what the writer of this particular part of Proverbs is trying to get you to do, is trying to get you to see, so if I want to trust the Lord, then I need to not do this, and I need to do this. Okay? So what's the thing we're not supposed to do? Well, we're not supposed to lean on our own understanding. We're not supposed to depend upon our own ability to perceive things accurately and to apply that information to how we live, how we think, how we feel, all those kinds of things. Okay? So that's what this means, right? But why is it important to do it? Why can't we trust our own intuition, our own learning, our own thoughts about things? After all, aren't we supposed to be smart, wise, thoughtful people who go out and make our own decisions? That's what our culture tells us. But there are some problems with that way of thinking about things. First, humans have a limited perspective. We just don't see things often as they really are. We just see them from one point of view. So imagine that you go out here and stand on this railroad track, okay? And maybe all of us have done this. You stand on this railroad track out here, and you look down the railroad track. And if you look down it far enough, it looks like the two rails come together into a single point. You're like, wow, okay, that's kind of weird. I wonder what the train does when it gets down to that point. So you decide, well, I'm just going to walk down there and see. So you walk down there and you're not really paying attention. You get down there and the rails are exactly the same amount of space apart. And you look down the track and, wait a minute, oh, there it is down there. Okay, so I'll walk down there and you keep walking. And pretty soon you've walked your way all the way to Abilene trying to find where these two rails come together. They don't, do they? It's an optical illusion. That's how a lot of things are in our lives. They're just things that we can't see. By the way, it's a good thing you didn't try this explanation because I just heard in the distance a train one.
Distance.
There it comes. So, that's kind of how a lot of things are. You see things only from one perspective. I mean, I don't know what it's like to be a peasant woman in China. I don't live in China, I never have. I'm not a peasant and I'm not a woman. But in the same way, a peasant woman in China doesn't know what it's like to be me. See? We see the world from our own perspective. But at the same time, humans have a limitless capacity for self-deception. We are fantastic at convincing ourselves that falsehood is true and truth is falsehood. In fact, the Christian psychologist Diane Langberg argues that it is that deception that stands at the very heart of all addictive behaviors and of all abuse. When you see a church or a civic club or a police department or a university where there has been rampant abuse, you can bet it's 100%. You can take it to Las Vegas and bet your house on it. There has been deception. And the one doing the abusing has deceived himself or herself, and they've deceived other people around them. We are good at it as humans, and we want to believe the deceptions that we create. So, humans have this tendency to deceive themselves, and our perspective is, limited. But, the truth is, wisdom doesn't belong to us in the first place. Wisdom is a property of God. And the Proverbs would tell us, to a lesser extent, of the community. So, there are lots of reasons why depending upon ourselves is counterproductive. So, the writer of Proverbs tells us not to do that. But he also tells us to do something else. To submit to God. To recognize who God is and to place ourselves under his authority and in his care. That's what it means to trust God. But we also need to ask ourselves, okay, we kind of get this idea, maybe what it means to trust God. At least we're moving that direction. We're starting to understand it. But to what extent are we supposed to trust God? How far is this supposed to go? And our text gives us a really interesting answer. We're supposed to trust, verse 5 tells us, God with our heart. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before. The heart is sort of the intersection point between the mind and the guts. It's where our thinking and our emotions come together at the core of our being so that we can make decisions. So that we can decide who we are and what we want. That's what the heart is in Hebrew thought. And God doesn't just want part of our heart. He wants us to trust him with all of our heart. With all of that part of us that is the core of us. But there's this interesting parallel phrase in verse 6. Remember, that first line in verse 6 helps us to define the first line in verse 5. Notice what it says. In all your ways, submit to him. So you see, this hard decision to trust God with all of who we are, with all of what we're doing, has to come out in our hands. It has to come out in all of those things that shape our lives. That's how the old writers of the Bible used that word ways, especially when they used it plural like this. Every aspect of how we live, of what we do, is to be submitted to God. It is language that is reminiscent of another text we've talked about. Remember Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5? Hear, Israel. Listen, Israel. The Lord is our God. The Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with what? With all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. All of your public presence in the world. Similar idea. Now that's a big ask. It is difficult to trust God in that way. And any of us who have followed Jesus very long, we know that's true. So why is it so hard? Why is it so difficult to trust God with all of who we are? Well, we could just say, well, sin, and just leave it at that. And, that, I guess that would be true as far as it goes, but it wouldn't help us very much. I think what we need to do is do a little bit of personal excavation. We need to look deep inside our own hearts, our own minds, and figure out, okay, how is it that I tick, and why is this so hard? And one of the reasons that trusting God can be so challenging is because when God comes to us and says, hey, I want you to do this, He almost never gives us all the information we need to make a fully informed decision. We just don't. Now, let me hasten to add that faith is not a blind leap into the dark. That is not what faith is. That's sometimes what atheist critics of Christianity believe faith is. But that is not what faith is. Faith is taking the information that we have and trusting that God will be faithful. Because the real issue is not, should I do this or do that? The real issue is, should I trust God in what He tells me? But you see, we like to use information to manage risk. We like to use information to keep some kind of control in our lives. And that moves us right into this second point, which is that humans need a certain amount of control in order to be psychologically healthy. That's just a brain fact. You have to have a certain amount of control over your life, or you're going to feel that out of control feeling. That anxious feeling. In fact, Harvard University economist Arthur Brooks defines hope as the sense that you can take meaningful actions that will actually benefit your own future and the future of your family. That's how he defines hope. And the absence of hope, as literature professor Diana Glyer reminds us, is despair. That's what it is. That's what it means to have despair, is that you have lost all hope. You have lost any sense that you can do anything to positively impact your life. And yet, it is precisely that position in which God wants to put us. Remember how we define trusting God. Not leaning on ourselves. Not depending on ourselves. Not trusting ourselves to get ourselves out of whatever mess we've gotten into. And maybe we ought to stop and ask a question that's just kind of hanging obviously in the room, but which I had not intended to address. Why would God do such a thing? And there's 1,000 answers, and not all of them are going to be very satisfying. And I understand that. Especially if your life has been marked with tragedy or trauma. And we can talk about that. It's okay. We really can. think the primary reason that God puts us in these anxiety-inducing situations where we have to say, okay, I don't have control over this situation, is so that we will recognize how truly limited we are. How truly limited we are. And so we will turn to Him and experience His goodness. But that experience of goodness can still be difficult. God asks us sometimes to do unpleasant things that are not exactly what we would prefer to do. Our ways are not His ways. Our thoughts are not His thoughts. Now, sometimes these things are unpleasant because they're difficult. But sometimes they are unpleasant because honestly they don't seem to be in our best interests. Think about Abraham. We talked about him several weeks ago. And what we said was that God comes to Abram in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and He says, all right, time to pick up stakes and move. I'm not telling you where, just move. And we talked about how that was going to be hard to do. That was going to be a difficult thing for Abram to do. But we also talked about how Abram might well have thought that this was not in his best interest. Oh yeah, God promised him some stuff. But at the same time, Abram had gotten wealthy. He was a well-established member of his community. And here God comes along and asks him to do something that just doesn't make any sense. And that's because it's not just that God's ways are higher than our ways and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His goals are different than ours too. Our goals typically revolve around our comfort and our happiness. God has so much more in mind. God has so much more in mind. Both for us and for the world. Now, with that list of obstacles in mind, you're probably thinking to yourself, why would anybody ever trust God in the first place? This looks impossible. Not only that, it looks unappetizing. Why would we trust God? The answer to that question is there in the second half of verse 6. Because if we trust the Lord with all that we are and with all that we do, if we commit ourselves not to be so sort of absorbed into our own ways of evaluating the world, but we open ourselves up to God and to others, if we'll do those things, then He will guide our paths. Now, if you trust God, you're already thinking, there it is. But if you don't trust God, you're also thinking, there it is. That's the reason you don't do this. God, I don't trust you. Why would I put you in charge of my life? Well, here's why. The great lie in our society is that you can direct your own paths, that you can make your own way, that you can shape your life the way that you want it to go. Now, it's a convenient lie because it gets us off our backsides and out there doing stuff. And the truth is, we can have a much bigger impact sometimes than we realize. So it's not to say that we don't have an impact. But the truth is, we're not strong enough or wise enough to shape our lives. See, that's what the language there in the second half of Proverbs is talking about. It's not just talking about God leading us down the right path. It's talking about God creating the paths that we will walk. It's talking about God shaping those paths, and we don't have the power to do that. So, here's our choices. We can either choose to let God direct our paths, or we can leave our paths to chance. And that's what we're doing when we try to do it all ourselves. We're leaving it to the nameless, faceless voices, or forces, I should say, of history. Or worse, if God's enemy takes an interest in us, we are leaving the shape of our future in the hands of malevolent powers who want to do nothing but destroy us. Those are our two choices. That's it. That's the list. And that's why we trust God. And it's that trust that is the foundation, the central pillar of a life of wisdom. Now, there is one question left to ask, and it's this. So how do we trust God better? How do we trust God better? And it may be trite to say it, but it is still true. There is no easy answer here. It is kind of simple, but it's not easy. The only way to trust God is to trust God. It is very much like riding a bicycle. You know, you can give somebody some basic instructions about how to ride a bicycle. But you're not going to explain all the physics behind bicycle riding to them. Just make their eyes roll back in their heads, you know. A 5-year-old doesn't need to know all of that. All they need to know is this is how you do it, and then they do it. Now, at first, you're holding the back of their seat as they ride down the street. You're running along with them, and they're pedaling, and they think they've got this. And then you let go, and they continue to go a little ways, thinking that you're still holding on, but you're not. Why? Because they've got to learn how to do all that complex physics stuff without a whole bunch of equations, but just by doing it. And they're going to get wobbly sometimes. They're probably going to fall down. And when they fall down, you don't just pick up the bicycle and throw it on the top of the garage and go, I'm not going to do that anymore. That hurt. No. You pick up your bicycle, you pretend it didn't hurt, and you get back on and keep trying. And hopefully you don't have too much blood gushing down your knees when you get back home to mom and dad, so they don't worry about you. That's how you do this. Well, faith is very similar to that. Trusting God is very similar to that. You just got to get on your faith bicycle and start pedaling. You just got to start trusting God. And then you keep doing it, and you keep doing it, and you keep doing it. And yes, you're going to fall off your bicycle sometimes. You might even put your bicycle away for a while because you're mad at God. you get it back out again. You get back on it again. And you keep riding. And the more you ride, the better you get. And the better you get, the more that riding a bicycle is actually fun. Well, the same is true of trusting God. The more that you trust Him, the more that you realize this is a really, really good thing to do. Let's pray. Father in heaven, I confess that sometimes it's just hard to trust you. And so we pray that you would help us. Because there are people sitting in this auditorium today who may have questions. They may have questions born out of frustration, born out of fear, born out of loss or sorrow, born out of deep, deep pain. And so we just pray that you would help us to put our trust